these are actually elements of ourselves. They're this other side of us, and I call this the Daemon. And I argue that the Daemon is within us all. The Daemon is our immortal self that manifests through the dominant hemisphere of the brain. Now, the Daemon itself is all-knowing, and we'll come back to this a second. But the entity that lives in the dominant hemisphere of the brain, I call the Eidolon. And the Eidolon is a being that lives its life linearly. Life travels through in a linear pattern. It doesn't see the future. It's not precognitive or anything else. And that's where most people exist within. But the Daemon seems to...
And here we are on phase 2 of our exploration, as we are exploring the Sherlock Holmes model of deduction. And it only comes with evidence, my friend, only with evidence. So, you know, I find it fascinating. You talk about the Daemon. One of my dear friends channels, and she refers to her teacher as the Daemon. And the Uber Daemon that you refer to as part of your hypotheses of how the reality is created. Let's talk more about that, Tony. Why don't we start with that?
Okay. Very much. I've always been fascinated. By training, I'm a sociologist, and I've also had a lot of involvement in psychology, and also I used to earn a living as a psychometrician, so it's kind of measuring personality and things. And I've always been intrigued by the seeming presence of another intelligence within human consciousness. And when I wrote my first book, Is There Life After Death, I was particularly interested in the idea that we have some form of spirit guide that guides us through life, something that has additional knowledge of our life. Now, I was really intrigued as to say, well, if there is an element of us that actually knows these things, what's the neurological, the neurophysiological aspects of this? But also, more importantly, how does that something know things? Where does its information come from? And my cheating the ferryman hypothesis very much argues that we are living this life again. We've lived this life many times as ourselves. So, in other words, Tony and San have had this conversation many, many times in the past. And part of us remembers that. And these are deja vu sensations. These are the ideas that, that I've done this before, I've experienced this before. And I argue, and I used to argue initially, that the Daemon exists in the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain. Now, again, some basic neurology here, and, probably teaching granny to suck eggs here, but just a basic understanding is that there are two hemispheres to the brain, the right and left hemisphere, and they are held together by something called the corpus callosum, which is a kind of a thick body that kind of holds the two together. Now, for years and years, neurologists and physiologists have been intrigued as to why most animals and birds and everybody else have two hemispheres. It makes no particular sense because, yes, we have two kidneys and we have and various other things that are doubled in the body, but the brain seems to be unnecessary in one way or another as to why that exists, particularly because within the brains, if you look at the underneath of the cerebral cortex, there are lots of other little structures in the brain that are also mirrored. We have two hippocampi, we have two amygdalas. It's as if everything is jeweled within the brain, with the exception of one object, or there's one or two, but effectively the pineal gland, which we can come on to later. But the argument is, why have we got two sides to the brain? And there was a series of discoveries made. We had touched before we started, we were discussing about hypnotism. And we know from the discovery of hypnotism that when people are hypnotized, they can go into different levels of trance state, and the hypnotist can take somebody down into lower and lower trance states. And very famous hypnotists such as Erickson was a particular famous hypnotist, and there was another guy whose name will come to me in a second. And they used to, when they took people down into deeper levels of trance, there would be a point where the normal everyday person would disappear and this new personality would rise up. And this new personality would be almost sarcastic and mocking of the hypnotist, as if it was in control of what was going on. Now, Ernest Hilgard, who was another famous hypnotist who discovered this thing, he coined the term the hidden observer. And he argued that when you're in deep hypnotism, another element of your personality, which is much more all-knowing than your normal personality, comes to the fore. And this is that part of your personality that knows things that you don't know, that it seems to be more aware of things. It seems to be psychic. It seems to have precognitive abilities. It seems to be able to anticipate what is happening to you. Now, this was pure hypnotism. And of course, hypnotism has always been a mystery, you know, animal magnetism, mesmer, and everybody else. But we know it works, but they don't necessarily know why. Then there was a series of fascinating experiments come operations that took place through the 1950s, done by a guy called Roger Sperry. And Roger Sperry was an interesting guy because Sperry was very much interested in curing epilepsy in people. And Sperry's argument was that, well, it's not his argument, we know this is what happens with a grand mal seizure, is that if the seizure starts, and I was talking before about the two sides of the brain, if the seizure starts in, the focal point of the seizure starts in one part of the brain and then spreads across the corpus callosum to the other side of the brain, the person loses consciousness. And this is extremely dangerous. So what they wanted to do was to find a way to stop it spreading. And they concluded the best way of doing this was to actually cut the corpus callosum itself and stop the signal going across from the dominant to the non-dominant hemispheres of the brain. And they started working with people who had intractable epilepsy, and they cut the corpus callosum of people. And what they discovered was astonishing. Because with every case, when they cut the corpus callosum, they discovered the person had two personalities, completely and utterly different. Now, interestingly enough, the non-dominant hemisphere, which in most people is the right hemisphere, because of the structures in the brain, it's usually non-verbal. Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the areas in the brain that language works. But the non-dominant hemisphere doesn't have those areas, but it does have a skill. And one of the skills it has is that it moves the opposite side of the body. So your left hemisphere of your brain moves the right side of your body. Okay. Which meant some interesting things. And they did an experiment with a young lad whose name he was I think he was known as C, I think was the name he called him, because they didn't want to identify him. And he was a young lad that had this operation done. And they're asking him what he wants to be when he grows up. And he explains, and he said, I want to be a quantity surveyor. As he was speaking that, his left hand that was being moved by the other entity in his personality in his brain, there was a group of Scrabble cards on the table. And he picked up the Scrabble cards and it wrote automobile racer. The guy was called PC. And it wrote automobile racer. And as Sperry argued in his book, he said, this was suggestive of the fact that we have two personalities always in our brain, and one of them is always being overridden because it's not in control, but it has a greater knowledge about what the personality really wants. Now, every operation they did, they found that they had these two personalities in the brain. Now, to me, this was intriguing. And in fact, Roger Sperry then worked with a guy called Roger Gazzaniga, and Sperry won the Nobel Prize for the work he did on split brain operations. But they never really got together with the idea of what were these two personalities, what was happening here. And I think it was in 1970, there was a psychologist at the University of Boston, I think, by the guy called Julian Jaynes. And Julian James was quite interested as to how, when you read ancient novels and when you read ancient poems such as Homer's Iliad, there is no concept of self. The characters in it all seem to are guided by the voice of God. And the voice of God in the Bible, you know, when Moses and everybody hears God, they identify this voice in their head as being God. And Julian James was particularly interested in this. And he came up with a concept he called the bicameral mind theory. And his idea was that up until around about 3000 BC, the corpus callosum was more effective. And we actually had the two hemispheres of the brain work together. But what was happening was that people would hear the voice of their own inner dialogue in their normal brains. And they would hear that as the voice of the gods. And this voice would be guiding them to do things. But because the corpus callosum was so effective, they got completely confused. And this is why we had the concept of the voice of God and the voice of entities and beings and demons and everything else that people heard in their brains. But when the bicameral mind took place, that is bicameral as in two rooms, which is the two sides of the brain, we split off from that. And the voices of the gods and that kind of weird world came locked inside the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain. Whereas our everyday self in the dominant hemisphere trucks along quite happily, thinking the universe, there's no weirdness and everything else because it's very rational, it's very black and white in the way it sees the universe. Whereas individuals like you, I'd argue, Sam, is that you are not bicameral, you're unicameral in the sense that you can attune into your non-dominant hemisphere and can use that consciousness and can draw that consciousness up. Now, we know from black magic and we know from normal magic, all the magicians forever, from the guys from medieval times back to the Kabbalists, back to the Gnostics, and going forward to people like John Dee and people like that, they were always trying to create what they called egregores. These are thought forms that they could manipulate for their own bidding to bring these beings in from somewhere else, which is what John Dee was doing when he did all these fascinating experiments. And Aleister Crowley was doing this when he created Awas and the various other beings that he communicated with. Now, what it seems to be taking place is these are actually elements of ourselves. They're this other side of us. And I call this the Daemon. And I argue that the Daemon is within us all. The Daemon is our immortal self that manifests through the dominant hemisphere of the brain. Now, the Daemon itself is all-knowing, and we'll come back to this a second. But the entity that lives in the dominant hemisphere of the brain, I call the Eidolon. And the Eidolon is a being that lives its life linearly. Life travels through in a linear pattern. It doesn't see the future. It's not precognitive or anything else. And that's where most people exist within. But the Daemon seems to know more things than we do. Now, the Daemon and the Eidolon as terminology, it's from ancient Greek. The ancient Greeks used to argue that at birth, people were given a tutelary spirit. They were given this being that would guide them through life. And this being would talk to you and guide you. Now, the everyday self, the Eidolon, the word comes from idol. It's kind of like a facsimile. And the Eidolon is the person that lives life linearly. But the Daemon is the other self. Now, for instance, in ancient Greek times, communication, as I said, with Julian James and everything, that was more open. And I give the example of Socrates. Socrates had a Daemon. And Socrates was known for having this Daemon. And he used to, when he was with friends, he would suddenly stop talking to them and he'd have this conversation with this other thing in his head. And he used to say that the Daemon in his head knew what was going to happen to him and it warned him of things he shouldn't do. And it's quite intriguing because when he was tried by the Athenian authorities for corrupting the youth of Athens. He was told to drink hemlock because he had to commit suicide. And the interesting thing was the Daemon abandoned him because he wasn't doing what the Daemon told him to do. And the Daemon basically said to him, I can't help you anymore. If you're going down this path, I know how it's going to end. It's not going to end well. I can't help you anymore. Now, I'd like to now scroll forward to another classic example of the Daemon. And it's something that a lot of people may be aware of, the story of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc heard voices. Remember the voices that she used to talk to? She thought it was the Archangel Michael, but there were 2 or 3 other voices that used to talk to her. And the voices, I believe, were the voices of her Daemon. And the Daemon guided her. And he helped her become a soldier. It taught her how to fight and everything else as well. And there's a very famous case when she was captured by the British, by the English. And she wanted to escape from where she was being captured. And the voice in her head, the voice said to her, please don't do this. It'll end badly. Do not do what you want to do. And she wanted to jump out of the window of where she was imprisoned to escape. And the voice in her head said, don't do this, because if you do this, I'm washing my hands of you because you'll end up dying. And I don't want this to happen this time. So she jumps out the window, and I think she breaks her leg or something, or she gets captured. And the Daemon didn't manifest at all. And when she went all through her trial, the voice was not there with her. And she died. Now, since then, I've then developed more and more the ideas of the Daemon. And I've been contacted by people from around the world, literally around the world, who have had demonic experiences where this voice in the head. I'll give an example. One guy wrote to me, and he was a sealess scout. These were people who they were the special forces in Rhodesia in the 1960s when there was an uprising. And he told me he was riding from a place called Mount Darwin back to Salisbury, which was the capital at the time. And he was riding on the top of an armored vehicle with a machine gun in front of him. And he was coming down a track. And suddenly a voice in his head goes, ambush, ambush, ambush. You must dive. Go, duck now, duck. He ignores it. Then he suddenly feels this something push him out of the where he was sitting. And as he was pushed out, a machine gun raked into the chair he'd been sitting in. And he said it would have hit him in the throat and the stomach and the groin. He would have been killed instantly. And he said, so what was that voice? What was it that saved his life? Other people tell me they're driving along in a car and a voice will suddenly go, swerve off the road now. And they'll swerve off the road. So this was extraordinary. Now, what I thought was then, well, how does this voice know this? And I believe that the voice knows it because it's you that's lived this life before. So it knows what's going to happen to you next. And it can, depending on how open your doors of perception are, is whether your voice, your eternal self, can talk to you. Now, I'd argue from when we've had private conversations, you have this voice in your head. You have this guide that talks to you, tells you what to do. And what's fascinating is the way you were telling me your guide wants to communicate with me more, which is interesting because the voice in your head knows this. Now, I'd argue, Sam, that your whole life has been a series of coincidences and chance meetings and everything else to get you to this point now talking to me. Everything behind has been a preparation for this conversation, as it is with me. It's all the flow, and the Daemon moves you like in a chessboard. It subtly moves you. It contacts you through dreams or sometimes hints. Now, again, I wrote a book a few years ago called Opening the Doors of Perception, because I argue that neurologically, depending upon how open your doors of perception are, is how imminent in your life your Daemon is. And it's again to do with the communication across the corpus callosum. And I argue that there is what I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And it's again reversing back to Aldous Huxley, who in 1954 wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, where he had experiences with mescaline. and peyote. Now, what I argue here is that most people, the communication channels between the higher self, the daemon, the dominant and non-dominant hemisphere, and the everyday self or eidolon are locked. They're closed, which means those people live their life very, very normally, and the daemon can't help them because it can't communicate with them. But some people, if you move along the Huxleyan spectrum, I always call it Aldous Huxley again, you know, so you move along the Aldous, and you have what I have, which is called classic migraine. And in classic migraine, when you have a classic migraine attack, you have what's called the aura state. Well, when you have classic migraine rather than normal migraine, classic migraine always involves an aura state. And it's an altered state of consciousness you go into before you have either the headache or the blackout or whatever. And I've had these many, many years. And whenever I get them, I get a profound feeling of deja vu. I get a profound feeling of recognition of what I'm doing. And I sense I've done it before. And then my vision starts to fade. And I actually get what's called a scotoma, which is a whiteout where my vision just goes white. And I lose the central vision at all. It just disappears. And because the white then disappears, and it literally disappears. There is nothing in my visual field. So I can move my arm like that, and I won't see it until it gets to right in the center of my vision. And many people get this, and many people who get classic migraine will agree with me on this. And when it's a very, very strange feeling, and you have this sense of a presence. It's what is known as the sensed presence. A guy called Michael Persinger did a lot of work on this, and I'll touch on the neurology of how this works later. It's all to do with the temporal lobes, and it's all to do with the way in which electromagnetic energy works with the temporal lobes. So I get this sensation, but I don't normally get any further than that. I have a feeling of my body is kind of expanding slightly, which is called Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where you feel like you're expanding or you're shrinking. But that's all I get. But if you move further along the spectrum, you then get what is known as temporal lobe epilepsy. And temporal lobe epilepsy is epilepsy that's focused on the temporal lobes, which is the area behind the ears within the brain. And of course, there's the right temporal lobe and the left temporal lobe, which is quite important as well. Now, the reason that the temporal lobe epilepsy is fascinating is because it now links back to the work I was discussing with Roger Sperry and everybody, because that's why they were trying to cut the corpus callosum, to stop the forest fire crossing the corpus callosum and making people unconscious. Now, this is where it gets very strange. Previous to this, in the 1930s, there was a neurosurgeon called Wilder Penfield. And Penfield's sister had died of epilepsy. She'd had a huge seizure and she died. Again, the seizure had gone from one side of the brain to the other. She'd lost consciousness and she died. He wanted to find a cure for this. And he realized as a neurosurgeon that the only way you're going to find this out is by mapping the brain. Because his argument was that if epilepsy starts in one part of the brain, the way you stop the seizure moving from the focal point is cutting round it. Rather using the argument of when you try to stop a forest fire, by digging a ditch around the fire and putting water in it or sand, you can enclose the fire in one location. And his logic was the same with the human brain. If you can find where the seizure starts, the locus point, you can cut round the areas around it and you can stop it spreading across the brain and causing people to have grand mal seizures. But he realized that you can only do this if you understand what part of the brain did what. Now, he was aware of the fact, as a neurosurgeon, that the brain doesn't feel pain. So he concluded that he could cut out sections of the skull, lift out the section, expose the cerebral cortex, and he was then able to test what the brain did. Because what he did was they put a local anesthetic around the skull itself, cut out the section of the skull, which allowed the subject, the person in the operating theatre, to be conscious, which meant that the person could explain what they were experiencing when certain parts of the brain were touched. And he had an electrode pen. And what he would do is he'd place the electrode pen on the surface of the brain and ask the person what they were perceiving. So if the person suddenly said, wow, I've just had a fantastic sensation of the color red, he was aware that that part of the brain was generating imagery or color. And over a period of time and over lots of patients, he created this diagram of what parts of the brain did what, because then he knew that you can't cut that bit of the brain out because the person, that's where sight is. So you can't play around with that, even if that's where the focal point of the epilepsy is. You've got to be careful. So he worked his way around and he got eventually to the temporal lobes. And he pressed the temporal lobes with the electronic pen on this lady's brain. And she goes, what have you just done? And he said, why? And she said, I'm back in my kitchen 20 years ago. And he said, what, you're remembering it? She's, no, I'm really there. And then she goes, oh, that's Johnny. It's my son. And she reckoned she could hear her son calling her. He then took the electrode off and she went, what have you just done? It's gone. And then he started talking to her about Johnny and asking about, his life and everything else. And he distracted her. And then he placed the electrode back on the point. She goes, Mike, I'm back there again. You put me back in my kitchen. He then found this happened regularly with the temporal lobes. So he came to the conclusion that the temporal lobes hold the memories, our whole life memories. Everything is encoded in the temporal lobes, but I argue that certain experiments over the years have discovered that the temporal lobes process memory. They don't contain it. They don't hold it. The memory is not there. It's rather like a hard drive, has all loads of photographs on. The photographs are not on your screen, but you feel that they are. And like the photographs are not on the temporal lobes. And he came to the conclusion at the end that you remembered everything. Now, I believe that people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, which is when they have seizures, the temporal lobes facilitate all kinds of incredible things that other parts of the brain don't. They elicit memories from your past that will just suddenly spontaneously appear. They will create out-of-body experiences because your somatic feedback is confused and you feel like you're floating outside of your body. But there's other things that they can do. Like, for instance, again, if you're interested, this will blow your mind. On my own podcast, a few years ago, I interviewed a young girl who has something called HSAM. That's highly superior autobiographical memory. This young woman remembers everything that's ever happened in her life, including every dream she's had and being in the womb. Okay. So I'm interviewing her live on the show. And my assistant then was a friend of mine, Sarah. And Sarah's daughter is very into Harry Potter. So Sarah's daughter, Sarah in our house has all the Harry Potter books. I knew that this young woman also liked Harry Potter. So live interview. And I turned around to her and said, I'm going to test you about your superior autobiographical memory. And she said, yeah, sure. And I said, you like Harry Potter, don't you? And she said, oh, I love Harry Potter. And then I said to Sarah, can you pick one of the Harry Potter novels at random? Then you pick a page at random and start reading a paragraph? And I turned around to the young woman and I said, I want you to finish the paragraph. Sarah got 6 words in. She read the whole paragraph. Absolutely 100% correct. I then did some inquiries, and this young girl, she is profoundly autistic, and they also think she's showing signs of temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, I believe this is because temporal lobe epileptics, this is what they attune into. It's as if the abilities to communicate with demonic consciousness is more open. So they can literally tune into what the Daemon normally knows automatically, but it confuses them. Okay. I've had, for instance, a few years ago when I wrote my book, The Daemon, you're going to love this as well. When I first wrote my book, about the Daemon, I get a message from an email from California. And in the email, it says, "You're not going to believe this, but I am a daemon. I am the daemon of an American Californian artist by the name of Myron Dial. My name is Charon. I am going to get Myron to contact you in the next few days. But believe me, I'm aware of your work and you are absolutely right." I get a message a few days later from Myron. Myron explained to me his life. Myron has had his daemon, who's called Charon, imminent in his life since he was 6 years old. Charon talks to him, Charon guides him, Charon takes him to a place called Zelkon, which is another world he goes to on a regular basis where he interfaces with entities and beings. Charon guides him. Charon gives him visions of the future. Now, Myron has now become a great friend of mine. I cite him regularly in my books. I've met him now twice in California, came along to my event at Contact in the Desert in Indian Wells this summer and 2 summers ago. Came along to my talk on him. So he was there in the audience when I was talking about the Daemon Eidolon dyad, as I'm explaining here. And he told me, for instance, one of the times he said Charon committed him into this visionary system. And he said, when I'm in that vision, he said, at that time, it was the early 1960s. I think he was a soldier in Vietnam at the time. And he said, I see an elderly man sitting at a table and he's surrounded by artwork and carvings and things, really weird. And then he said many years later, he'd forgotten about this image. And he's sitting there one day in his studio, many years later, and he senses somebody watching him behind. And he realized it was his earlier self watching him in the studio. Now, again, I go off on tangents here, but I also wrote a biography of Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer. And Philip K. Dick, the book I called A Life of Philip K. Dick, the Man That Remembered the Future. Because I believe, again, Dick's daemon was manifest in his life. And Dick describes almost exactly the same set of circumstances that Myron had when he saw himself, when he was very young. He used to see a man standing at the bottom of his bed. And then many years later, he has this vivid dream and he's standing there looking at his younger self in a bed. And he realizes that the person that his younger self sensed was his future self looking at him. Now, again, this is because Philip K. Dick called his daemon Vallee. He called it many things. And he wrote a novel about it called Vallee, about this other part of him. He also had, in Vallee, he has 2 characters. One of the characters is called Philip K. Dick, who's a science fiction writer. And there's another character who's called Horselover Fat, which is a really strange name, but not if you're a linguist, because you'll realize that Horselover in Greek is Philhippus and Dick is German for fat. So Horselover Fat is actually Philip Dick. Now, this is how clever Philip K. Dick was trying to get his ideas across about his daemon, about this higher self that guides him. Okay. And I'll give a little bit of evidence about this, and this is extraordinary. And I'm the only writer that's written about this. Philip K. Dick saw his own death. Okay. I have in my possession a copy of a letter he wrote to his pen pal, Gloria Krentz Bush, in, I think, around about 1974, when he had what was called his theophany, where he felt that his mind had opened up. And in the letter, he explains in various letters before this as well, he explains in his letters that there was this entity that was eminent in his brain, and it was talking to him and it was guiding him and it was doing all these things. In the letter he sent, it's typewritten, and he said, last night I demanded the entity show itself to me. And suddenly then I had a series of powerful hypnagogic images. And hypnagogic images are those images you get just as you're waking up or going to sleep. And he said, I saw underwater cities. And then I saw one stark image lying on the floor between a table and a sofa was a portly middle-aged man lying on his back. And then he handwrites, underlines it, and said, "I think I'm becoming precognitive." Dunk, dunk, dunk. Strange image. Roll forward to 1982, I think it is. I don't remember, it was 81 or 82. Phil and his then wife, Tessa, had split up and he was living on his own. And he used to, every Tuesday, he would meet up with his friend Tim Powers, who's another science fiction author, wrote The Anubis Gate, really great novel. And Tim and they'd meet up and there were a book circle. One Tuesday evening, he didn't turn up. So Tim told me this, and I saw Tim write something about this without making the link. Tim goes round to his house and they have to knock the door down. And they go into the living room and there, lying between a sofa and a coffee table, was Philip K. Dick, who'd had a massive stroke. That was exactly how Phil described the set of circumstances that he saw in a hypnagogic image 8 or 9 years before. Now, that is uncanny. That is the Daemon in action. That is the Daemon's memories. In other words, Phil was attuning into the memories of his own Daemon, because already his mind had already opened up with his theophany, his 2374 theophany. So moving then forward, we have this kind of this Daemon's ability to know the future. Going back to my Huxleyan spectrum, I then argue that the doors of perception are locked closed. Then for people like me, they're slightly open. Then for people with temporal lobe epilepsy, they're widely open. Then when the doors are completely open, we have schizophrenia. Because what is taking place then is that the eidolonic consciousness is being bombarded by the information field of the knowledge of the Daemon to such an extent that people literally go crazy. They hear voices. They cannot the world they're seeing, the world they are seeing breaking down. They're seeing the holographic nature of Maya, the holographic nature that we talk about, the idea that this is an illusion. And it starts to break down. It's like the imagery you see on the film The Matrix, where you see all the digital numbers flowing down. You're breaking through and you're seeing it breaking down into pieces. This is what happens with schizophrenia. Now, I know a number of people who've experienced schizophrenia. I've also spoken to one of the world's leading experts on schizophrenia, basically Professor Alec Jenner. And when I spoke to him, I asked him, what is schizophrenia? He'd spent his whole career, and he said, I have no idea. I don't know what is happening with schizophrenia. I argue it's because the communication channels are open and literally the people can't control it. This is why the schizophrenia features in many times in Julian James's book on the bicameral mind, for exactly the same reason. His model was very similar to mine, but I take it much further. So to me, what is really taking place here is that I use the term right and left hemisphere because I think that works and people can understand that. But I think it's more complex than this. I think that it's in neurological terms, I think what is taking place is the Daemon consciousness exists in something called the astroglial network in the brain. You know, people, you hear the term, people turn around and say, we only use 10% of our brains. People use that term, but they don't know what it means. What it means is 10% of your brain is made of neurons, neuron cells in the brain that communicate electrochemically through things called synapses, where each dendrite runs down and each nerve doesn't quite touch the next nerve, and there's a tiny thing called the synaptic gap, and then neurochemicals go across between one side into receptor sites on the other side, and this is how communication takes place across the brain. And depending upon whether the neurotransmitter are excitatory or inhibitory, depends whether the signal goes across or not, and different neurotransmitters do different things. But that's only 10% of the brain. Inside the brain, the neurons are held in position by things called glial cells. And 90% of the brain cells are glial cells. Glial is actually Greek for glue, because that's what they thought when Kajol and people did their work on looking at the structure of the brain through a microscope. They could see these neuron cells and all these other little cells around that look like stars. That's why they're called the astroglial. They're like little stars, and they communicate very differently. Now, recent research, again, I'll say one of the biggest problems, if you want a neurologist to get really worried about what you know about what happens in the brain, turn around and ask them about the binding problem. The binding problem is why we have a feeling of simultaneity, how it feels that we in other words, now your ears are hearing things and one part of your brain is processing that. Another part of your brain is processing the visual imagery you're seeing around you. Another part is processing sound. But we have a feeling everything is happening now at this moment. But that's impossible, because although the brain communicates electrochemically very quickly, it's not that fast. And scientists just do not know how we have the feeling of now. Research has recently been shown that the astroglial network in the brain communicates non-locally. It communicates using quantum mechanics. It uses something called non-locality, which means that it can communicate instantaneously, which means it doesn't need chemicals. It doesn't even need contact. Now, I believe that the actual demonic memory is actually the astroglial network, and the eidolon is the neurological network. Now, if the astroglial network works as I believe, it works holographically. So it can communicate instantaneously. And this is why it links with Taoism. Because the non-locality and the hologram's quite interesting. Holographic image, if you smash a painting or a picture or a jigsaw puzzle into its pieces, every piece is just that particular part of the picture. If you smash a holographic image, however, each shard, each piece contains the whole image. It's slightly denuded, but it means the parts contain the whole, and the whole contains the parts. So suddenly we have very much the teachings of Lai Tzu and everybody else, the idea that everything is contained within everything else. Everything is in communication with everything else instantaneously. Everything is a flow. Everything is instantaneously communicating from the further reaches of the universe to the atoms in your brain. Now, if this is the case, this explains how Penfield's memories work. Because if we do remember everything that happens in our lives, and certain people like my Australian friend can recall everything, why can't the rest of us? And we can't because we're stuck in the neuron network, or stuck in the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain, to use an analogy. So if we can attune into that greater information field, we are then attuning to everything that's in the universe. And I argue that the daemon itself is not the end of the model. So we have the eidolon that lives in this enclosed world that's neurological. Then we have the daemon, which has access to the astroglial network and the information field of that. Now, again, the information field, I think, is also drawn up from something called a 0-point field, which is the quantum vacuum. Now, there's been work done by somebody called Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose won the Nobel Prize last year or 2 years ago for physics. And Professor Hamerhoff is an anesthesiologist from the University of Arizona. Penrose is a British guy, mathematician. The two of them have come together and they've come up with something they called orchestrated objective reduction. Orchestrated objective reduction argues that within the neurons of the brain are little structures called microtubules. And microtubules, there are literally trillions of them, and there's billions of them in every neuron. Now, they're interesting because they act like tiny holograms, because they fire single photons of light either side. And they argue, Hamerhoff and Penrose argue, that this light, this inner light, this What again within your teachings is the idea of, is it said the Tansen inside the brain, the place, the light, the light of transcendence that exists within the brain. This is what it is. This is how powerful Taoism is. This is what they're discovering now. There's things called biophotons, and biophotons are electromagnetic energy that's given off by the cells in the brain. It's effectively given off by DNA. And in fact, they've now discovered that light comes out of the eyes as well as coming in. So we're ejecting out light and electromagnetic energy.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go deep on this because, I mean, that's part of the alchemical process.
Mm.
Is channeling the light from the Bai Hui, and it comes down, and it is projected from the two physical eyes, but there are 9 eyes within this upper Dantian system.
Well, isn't it? It's in the upper Sansen. Is it that the word? There's the upper and lower. I've got a note of it here somewhere. The Tantians.
Dantian, yeah. The Dantian.
The lesser heavenly cycle and the circulation of light.
There is variables. You know, what we're talking about is when we talk about the center stream of light, because this is where supreme purity, which is the immortalized version of Lao Tzu, presides in the upper Dantian and channels the sun and all light that creates the cosmos. Yes. And so this is where he is housed. And when I initiate anyone within the Taoist alchemy, the initiate will start to create a relationship. So every time they mention Lao Tzu or supreme purity, they will feel the sensation of, you know, something is moving within the upper head area from right to left, and it's almost like someone's playing with your brain with like Play-Doh.
Can I jump in because this is extraordinary? Okay, because this is quite important. Many years ago, one of my associates is a top researcher in near-death experiences, a lady called Evelyn Alassa Vallerano. And many years ago, she invited me to speak in Switzerland for the Scientific and Medical Network in Switzerland. And I became friendly with her. And she said, when you come over, there are 2 people I want you to meet. Specifically, I want you to meet a guy called Engelbert Winkler, who lives in the Tyrol in Austria. And Engelbert is a consultant psychologist. And together with his friend, Dr. Dirk Prokol, who is a consultant neurologist, they have invented a machine they call the Lucia, the hypnagogic light device. And the reason that Engelbert wanted to speak to me was he'd read my first book and he'd had a near-death experience when he was a child. And he turned around to me and said, "You're the first writer that's actually got it. You're the first writer that really is understanding what the near-death experience really is." And he wanted to meet me. So anyway, they wanted me to test this device, and they'd only invented it about a year before, and they built it up from scratch. The reason initially was that Engelbert works with troubled children, and in the Tyrol, there's high mountains and there are valleys, and in the winter, there's no real natural light. And he wanted to have a machine that could create natural light, so he could put children into slight hypnotic states, so he could help them develop. So they bring this machine together, but they then realized they could play around with the intensity of the light and use stroboscopic effects as well. And when they did this, they found they could put people into altered states of consciousness. They wanted me to test it. So they wheel this thing in. Now, I don't know how old you are, but I remember when I was growing up in the late 1950s, there was a film with Gene Barry called The War of the Worlds, which was an adaptation of the H.G. Wells novel. And there were these kind of spaceships, and they were attacking cities in America, and they were like that. And they had these death rays coming out. This machine looked like that. They weave this thing out, and it's like a big eye on a stalk. And I go, "Oh God, this is a bit freaky." And they wheel it in. It's, by the way, it's on video. It's on my YouTube site where they filmed what happened to me. And they wheel this thing in, and I sit in front of it. And I said, "What can I do?" And they said, "Just close your eyes and just wait for the flashes." So I close my eyes and I see flickering. And I'm going, okay, fine. After about, they gave me the strongest dose, by the way. They didn't tell me that till afterwards. I'm sitting there and then nothing happens. And I'm really embarrassed because I'm thinking, what am I going to say to them? They're so keen to impress me for this thing, but it's not doing anything. And then suddenly it did. And there was this flash of blue light that came over one side and then red light. And they started to go into a vortex, you know, literally the tunnel effect that you get in near-death experiences. And it was like a tunnel. And I said, have you changed the color of the light? And Dirk goes, no, you can open your eyes. You'll see it's still white light. So I opened my eyes and yeah, it was just flickering white light. So I closed them again and I'm back in all this kind of wild imagery and flickering things. And then I'm looking and my extreme right-hand side, there's something breaking down. There's kind of flickering down here. So I turned around to Dirk and I said, can I look away from the light? Sounds like the film Poltergeist, doesn't it? Look, don't go towards the light. And he said, yes, you can, because your brain's encoded it now. And I turned around and I still cannot believe what I saw. I was hovering above the planet in Earth orbit, in planet orbit. I could see the edge of the planet and it had blue lights going around it. And there were blue lights in a checker pattern flickering into the distance. Being the brave me, I said, God, turn it off. Just went completely. I then discovered, and there's a guy that looks very like you that I used to work with, who sadly is no longer with us, called, his name will come to me anyway, but he looks very like you. And he's also an Aussie guy. He's now a body experience guy. His name is very famous because he was a very famous Scottish hero who had the same name. Anyway, it'll come to me in a second. But anyway, so I contacted him on it, and he said, look at the back cover of my book on astral projection. And he said, that's what you're seeing. You were seeing the astral plane. And then I started researching, and I found, and I know he is known for being a bit of a charlatan, but there was an American anthropologist, again, whose name escapes me now, who wrote about Don Juan de Matis. It was a series of books with a shaman. His name will come to me, but he had a concept called the lights of the world, and that's what I saw. So I saw two things: the astral plane and the lights of the world, things I didn't know about in this imagery. Okay, so but why I'm mentioning this story is after I'd finished it, I go over and I'm talking to the two doctors, and also with me that day was a guy called Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who's the world's expert on deja vu, who come down to see me from Bern. American guy, American Jungian analyst, really nice guy. But anyway, I'm talking to them, and as I'm talking to them, there is something moving in the center of my forehead, and it's like this little creature moving around, and it's going bzzz, bzzz. And it was happening every 10 minutes. And I was going, poof. We had a dinner party that night and it didn't stop. It was there all the time. I went to bed that night. I saw snakes looking up at me, Kundalini snakes circling around. I could sense the Kundalini feelings going up and down my spine. And the snakes were looking at me and mocking me. Now, there is a book written by a guy called Jeremy Narby.
Now, just for the audience, you're seeing this with your eyes open.
Yeah.
We're going to get into that.
Okay. So Jeremy Narby wrote this book, The Cosmic Serpent. Now, what it seems from what Narby is discussing and everything else as well, what had actually happened was the light had actually opened up what you would call as the inner sansan, the pineal gland. It had opened up the pineal gland, and I believe, and I do, again, the physiology of this. So if anybody's out there that's saying I'm talking a load of crap, I'm not. I do the physiology. That the pineal gland had started to excrete endogenously, internally generated dimethyltryptamine. And it was synthesizing dimethyltryptamine from melatonin. Now, melatonin and DMT are very similar molecular structures. So it's not at all surprising. And I believe that what was happening was that my inner eye, my third eye, whatever it was, had been opened by the light device. Now, I then did some research on this, and it gets stranger because apparently at the 29th day of gestation, when the baby's in the womb, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland sit at the back of the throat in an organ called the epiphysis. As the 29th day passes, the epiphysis moves up from the back of the throat to the center of the brain, where the pineal gland and the pituitary gland split into the two glands, leaving something called Rathke's cleft or Rathke's pouch that runs down the back of the throat to the back of the throat. Now, if the pineal gland can stimulate and create DMT, the DMT could run down there. And there's something called Kakara Mudra. And Kakara Mudra is something that Indian holy men do, sadhus do, where you train yourself to place your tongue at the back of the throat. And under certain conditions, under certain terms of meditation, they say they taste something called the nectar of transcendence, Amrit. And it has a particular taste, and it puts you into altered states of consciousness. You go shamanic traveling and everything else. It's endogenous DMT. It's dripping down the back of the throat. And again, I think I'm the only writer that discusses this. But still, lots of people want to ignore me. So be it. It's their loss. And this is now why an awful lot of people are in the DMT world are very interested in my world. This is why Dr. Pascal Emmanuel, who wrote the foreword to my last book, was asked me, could he write the foreword? He's one of the world's young leading neuroscientists. And he's writing about DMT, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and his work is extraordinary. But he wanted to write the foreword to my book because, a lot of these guys, believe me, I'm already gone down the path. So your comment then really struck me, and I go, wow, spot on. It's what happened to me. I know it's true because it happened.
And the DMT is produced when we go into embryonic breathing. It's a primordial state. So you're literally through a conditioning. All of this is conditioning for any Taoist alchemist. So when you understand the layers and you start to become in tune with what we call the substance, which is the fabric of reality, you will form things. So when I look out and perceive the world, everything it's just as you described it, like the Matrix. But when I first experienced it, when it all turned on, is just so much information that you just want to just off yourself. It's just too much at once.
What is it? Overload? Is it information overload?
Everywhere you go is information, energy, and you are not just perceiving your auric field. It is substantive. It is so tangible that you will bump into people and their auric fields because of the amount of density of the energy. And that is variable. Now, we briefly spoke about an experience that you had, I think, in Athens, where someone charged you with energy in the airport. Yep. This is a conditioning that we get to when you are trying to basically harness this what people refer to as chi, but it's so dense that you saturate the body. It's a level of chi packing where you completely saturate the 50 trillion cells that are the flesh and blood that you perceive as your body itself, and you start to charge it and then play with it like Play-Doh, and you're moving it through the systems. So it starts up here, and then the upper middle dantian merge together, and then the lower dantian is then the basically the workshop where you can then harness the energy and distribute it at will. Now, to the degree that you experienced with that gentleman that charged you, this is a concentrated conditioning that can take up a lot of time. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I normally go to bed and we have what we call an amber effect, where by the time I wake up in the morning, I feel like a stiff glove, like a mitt from a baseball mitt. There's so much energy charged throughout my body that it's from head to toe. I am so tight. And as I break that threshold, you just watch and feel the aura expand and the energy expand past the body. and now this is a pulsating energy. It's like you just refreshed the system and charged it. Now, I attribute this to when I talk to people about how they have OBEs, NDEs, and sleep paralysis is a more common thing. This is the entry level when we start walking in spirit projection, what we call Shen Gong, which some people will refer to as astral projection. You are conditioning the body, and some of the simplest ways is through the respiration, which is the gateway to what we call the primordial mother. So someone that has, I always bring people back to the suggestion of this, someone who has sleep apnea or issues with sleep paralysis is an evoking of that next level of phase of leaving perceived physical body, because you store so much energy within the flesh, your spirit just pops right out, as opposed to where I refer to as the third person, first person, no person. Now, I've been doing this for years. I do it at will. I'm doing it right now. I'm talking to you and experiencing a visual experience that most people would consider absolutely insane. It's very normal for me to experience and see and feel external substance. So in my view, I am looking at you in a computer screen, and the environment is normally a black drop. It's black, it's void, and then I can just put my attention to something, and I'm in the stars, or I'm down at the ground zero of Twin Towers. It doesn't matter where it is. I can feel into it instantaneously, and it is visual. It's as vivid as it is seeing you. And there's a substance that's generated where you can reach out and touch someone. Now, when I teach people this alchemical process, some things that are quite simple is as you start to conjure this energy and you codify it in the body, you can do things like 2 candles is always an entry-level apprentice-like state, where you take 2 candles, and because of the amount of concentrated energy that you are cultivating, as you project it from the byway through Shen, what we call Shen projection through the eyes, you will move the candles at will with your attention intention. So the flames will move with your attention intention, and it can be emitted from what we call Lao Gong points, which are the hands and feet. But there's a conditioning that takes place where initially people would be rushing to WebMD. Oh my goodness, I'm feeling all this tingling, all this incredible concentration of energy in my hands. Well, when you start to develop sensory perception within this alchemical process, that your whole body feels like that. You're a tuning fork. And so
is this then the equivalent of the vibrationary state that people have when they have
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you can do it at will. So when I say first person, third person, no person, most people that are familiar where they have out of body experiences, there's a perception, and then it's like I now want to see things outside of my own body to validate that this is taking place. So the normal run-of-the-mill process is get out of my body, see that I'm laying there, that the environment is still present, and I am supposedly floating in this ether. And then you all of a sudden transition from that to no person, where you can be at any moment bilocate or non-location at will with a conditioning. And it's not like I have to shut the body down to obtain this level of conditioning. And that's a trained sort of processes, and that's where what we call Shen projection, where you are now. So if I was like engaging with someone for combat or martial form, the internal alchemical process is to witness the aura, find their weakest link, which you would look at the organ that is most efficient. Because when I read people's auras, all the energy centers have all the information mentally, emotionally, physically about that person. And then what's the condition of their aura? The elements, being the 5 elements, are heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, spleen. And we look for the weakest one, and that's the first thing that you attack. So you attack it on an energetic level, already making the person deficient. And then by the time you apply contact, you've broken down different layers of conditioning. So if someone was into, you may have heard of iron shirt training. These are alchemical processes where you you emanate a level of, it's almost like a field of energy, and you wanted to basically saturate it so that there's 3 levels of that you have to break. So when you're fighting an opponent, you literally have to hit them 3 times before you break through that field if they're practicing internal alchemy. And so iron shirt training is conditioning and saturating the cells, what we call chi packing, where you have a field of armor on that you don't feel a single thing through contact. And so it's fascinating that you're talking about these things, but like we can literally correlate everything that you're saying. I can correlate into the alchemical process and validate it for the experiencer, because that's exactly what's going on. And so when we look at when you're experiencing that sensation in the upper dantian, when I want to look into someone's soul, I go straight into the left eye, and anything tells you that the opposing or coupling effect, and you can water it down to something as neurocoupling, the effect is always opposite. So when we look into the soul, it will attach itself to the right side of the brain, which is everything in theory and everything that you're talking about, which is the gateway to the Daemon. And so when you look in through conditioning, you can see everything about. I've had when I first started this, I would be walking in a restaurant, or I'm in a cafe and I'm standing in line and I want to get some something to eat, a donut and a coffee, whatever. And as I'm approaching the counter, my first real sobering moment was I was looking around the room and there was guys preparing food in behind the counter, and then the barista. And I look at the barista, I ask for the coffee, and I look over at one of the guys that was doing some preparation in the back, and I looked straight at him. He looked at me. When I looked into his soul, he was a murderer, a pedophile. All this stuff just came up, and he looked at me like he saw a ghost and went, "You can see me." And these are the types of things that take place on a level of conditioning, and it's instantaneous. We refer to this as another sensory perception. The idea that there's only 5 or 6 senses is, in my opinion, a lie, because the conditioning puts you in a level where you can access anything at will. You just have to have the system, and that's the method that we teach within alchemy.
Wow. It's because it's funny, as you're speaking there, I'm seeing so many links to things people have said to me over the last 20, 25 years in terms of the work I've been doing. And it's quite intriguing how it all mirrors, it all makes sense. There is levels of understanding here that are uncanny. There are people I know who, have out of body experiences and everything else as well. And the things they're describing very much reflect the teachings you're doing, and also the writings of a friend of mine called Jason Gregory, who we touched upon earlier, who writes on Taoism. And it's the idea that I always feel that at some stage I'm going to be able to get together with a group of people. There'll be 6 or 7 of us, and we'll be in a room, and we will create what I call, but an egregore, a thought form that is a collective thought form created by all of our knowledge and all of our abilities. And it'll click. It will suddenly everything will make sense. It's suddenly a paradigm changer. I mean, one of the things as a sociologist, I've long been interested in the way in which science develops. It's very much the current concept of the theory of scientific revolutions. And I believe we're getting to the point now whereby we've moved out of the Aristotelian into the Newtonian, into the Einsteinian and the quantum mechanics. But we're now moving further afield. I mean, I remember many years ago, the Fritjof Capra book, the Tao of Physics. And that was a great influence on me when I was very much younger. And a guy called, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Jacques, somebody or other. And he was very much applying the Taoism idea as well. And to me, I'm very much of the feeling of the Aldous Huxley idea of the perennial philosophy, that within all philosophies, within all religious philosophies, there is this inner truth, the inner truth that people know, that people adepts know about. Because, for instance, I was astonished many years ago when a group of Sufis wanted me to go and talk to them in a Sufi monastery in northern Cyprus. Then I had a group, really weird, I had a group of Mormons turn up at one of my talks about 10 years ago. And they said, we've been listening to you, watching your videos, coming to your talks. And do you know you're actually doing the science of Mormonism? And I'm going, what? And then I get an invite from the Servants of the Light, who are the Western esoteric tradition's biggest teaching school. And the lady who's the top lady, there's a lady called Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki. And they invited me to speak at one of their big celebrations. People flying in from all over the world to this, strangely enough, a kind of a Jesuit training college up in the hills in the north of England that the Jesuits had left to allow these mystics to come in. And she turned around and she said to the people that were there, and it was actually like a scene from the Tom Cruise Stanley Kubrick film Eyes Wide Shut, because they were all in cowled clothing. It was just weird. I was the only person. I was in a suit, and there were all these people in these kind of weird esoteric things. And she turned around and she said, Anthony's done the science of what we believe for a long time. She said, Anthony's concept of the Daemon is exactly what we believe. It's the idea we train people to find that inner something that is part of the greater something. It's like the Gnostics used to argue, didn't they, that there are two universes. There's the kenoma and the pleroma. And the kenoma is this universe, and the pleroma is the fullness. And inside all of us is a little shard, a jewel of the pleroma, and it's inside us. And we need to develop it and find it and develop it in one way. By the way, the person you look like is, and he's gone again. The name's gone again. It came to me before. Oh, it'll come again. It'll come again.
Yeah.
But you're about to say something.
You're talking about, and there's different alchemical processes that you may come across that are more for commercial use only, or what most of these teachers that put out their version of Qigong is what they refer to as rice bowl training. And what that means in a nutshell is someone is literally pulling dust out of the air and throwing together a couple of things with an experience and then putting a stamp on it saying this is ancient in its nature. Now, for me, I'm a Pepsi challenge guy from the 80s. I'll take the Pepsi taste test with anyone on this stuff. Show me, the psychokinetic processes of being able to attune to a state where people are having a visceral somatic kinesthetic experience is where I get down with the get down. And most people tend to, like, when I speak to a lot of the youngins these days that are channeling or to some degree aware of their more divine self, they're more open vessels. And then, when we go into conversation, I'll invite them on my podcast and they'll be like, what the hell is this? I have never experienced this degree of resonance where I'm feeling it through my body right now. Now, I would say you're a little bit more humble, but your sensory perception is a lot more developed than you may want to play it out to be as such. Because what have you described, or do you describe your exploration of energy potential? Do you go deep into it? Because we are in union right now, and you and I are just pulsating back and forth with the energy. And so when we both speak on things, our bodies start to illuminate and emanate a correlated experience where it's like, oh my goodness, you say that. When a light bulb goes off, you experience it in the body, an expansive chill and emanation. And so what most people tend to freak out, because I'll be like, oh, see, we're in tune. And they're like, what are you talking about? Well, I'm experiencing what you're experiencing because that's part of my conditioning. I can see it and feel it if I choose to. Vice versa, when there's zero boundary, you are at one. And it's really you dictating, as you refer to the Daemon. When I deal with people that are at a what they call a verge of a need for exorcism. So, when I'm exercising someone through the rituals that I teach people, you bring what they refer to as the entity that is feeding from their stream, where they can't turn it off. They cannot turn off the information, the sound, anything. And so what happens is I'll condition the person to bring that energy. That entity will move into the center line, which is what we call the Taiji pole, and then it will literally burn up back to dust and be reclaimed as light. And so that's an exercising processes that will then unwind within their physical body, and they'll look like something out of the exorcism, where their body is unraveling, and it looks not Daemon, but demonic in its nature. And people don't realize this is all trapped. And then all of a sudden, now they have this monologue with a dialogue, not just one or the other. And now we have a stream of information that you can have a very clear communication with. And this is how I speak and channel my teacher, Latsu. I speak to endless, infinite amount of entities, and I will communicate with them or not in my own choosing, but they're as vivid as I see you and I hear you. And I feel like I was conditioned as a young man to remember my many thousands of lives as a Taoist priest to be able to access the spirit world. And so when you embody that, you are forming this relationship that makes it so. So there's a very powerful incantation that is like the morning rites, that is the beginning of any day for an alchemist, that Latsu has always used for thousands of years. And it's as simple as this: as I stand here before you under the divine light of the Tao, with unconditional love and acceptance for everything that you share with me. Now, as you ignite that and set forth a rippling effect, as you refer to the Daemon, my teachers come forth and then agree and are surrendering themselves to my sacrifice in body, mind, and spirit. And then they remind me that I am the physical, energetic, and spiritual manifestation of divine word, will, light, love of the Tao. Furthermore, all is one, one is all. You are abundant, timeless, endless, limitless, infinite, the truth to everything. You are the portal between the spirit realm and the realm of man. You are a wuzit. A wuzit is referred to a spirit communicator. Then you are the spiritual leader. Furthermore, you are now the altar that connects heaven and earth. And from that unravels a whole nother gateway, and you go deep into communication. You get your directive and mandate for the day, and then that opens up a whole path. And if for anyone that uses that incantation from this conversation, they're even slightly energetically sensitive, they're going to freak out, because it's initiating a cohesive moment where you are becoming one. And that's the power of when you in tune with the energy, the commanding of it through an incantation starts to alter the material that we're experiencing right now in what they would consider a material 3D reality. And this is kind of like the entree into magic and what we do to lay down grids, and how you were talking about how many of the people that you're talking about were creating this aggregate that is forming some type of like entity that does the bidding of the conjurer. Now, for Taoism, there is a system that we refer to as deity magic. I have never been a fan of that, nor do I ever have a relationship with it, because what happens is a very fallen state for many alchemists, because they immediately assume that space, that entity is for their bidding. Yet when I create a relationship with another spirit entity, it's an equal and mutual reciprocation. And so by doing that, you're not at basically the mercy of their commands, because they will offer things to you that you perceive you cannot obtain. And all of a sudden now you're going down a slippery slope. And because of the deficiency of the individual, because everything is set with you are the master keeper creator of this whole experience, that you will start to form things that look more like karmic evidence that is part of this symbiosis of yin and yang. And then the more and more you feed into it, the more and more deficient you become, the more and more that energy will become a succubus that will make everything inverted. And this is where you start falling down the path of mortality, and you corrupt the physical body and it can't hold the charge anymore. And that's where we go into, crash and burn effects of people that become too obsessed with certain aspects of this righteous Taoist path of remembrance. And so all of this is part and parcel, but truly staying united or in that unified state we refer to as the Wu Ji, the void, the primordial mother. To do that, you must recognize the rite of passage is dualistic to non-dualism, to centric to non-centric. When you walk through the center point, everything dissolves. There is no more title. There is no more need to go into the depth of understanding any other parts, because you are the animation to everything. That means that you don't have to say anything. It's created instantaneously. So, most people get into this relationship where it's a dialogue, where they're talking, as you would refer to it, to their Daemon. You have become the personified emanation of such. You are the animation within Taoism. You are the animation, the mother that animates consciousness, that consciousness animates the spirit animates the energy animates the body. This is a self-righteous path of remembrance that turns into selflessness and servitude that you cannot fight, because you have crossed over that as you would put it, that level of separation, and everything is as one. Now, if we rewind this down to the simplistic understanding of conscious and unconscious, when I was talking briefly about how I would walk up to people and put them into a state of bliss without mentioning the word hypnosis or trance, because I'm holding a resonance that I'm just the tuning fork. I contain all resonances of any existence of anything within this creation. You attune to it, and then all of a sudden people just melt into it. This is a very common initiatory state for what people refer to as psychokinesis. And so that attuning instantaneously puts you into what most people would consider a very limited amount of somnambulistic state. It doesn't matter. I don't care who you are. You will enter that state and go beyond it, so that all of a sudden, if you measure the brain waves, the idea that you're shifting gears from epsilon all the way up to gamma or lambda at will through your attunement is really how you're obtaining your abilities, because that's how I witness healings. I used to measure my brain waves all the time. I never hit a high past, but I could be anywhere between 40 or 400 hertz, and I'm witnessing physical healings. So this is kind of like, this is where I get excited with all the things that you have discovered and researched over your lifetime, because I know you and I can sit down and correlate all of them. Like, there are no exceptions. That's the exciting part. And you and I just beaming each other, that charge of energy that's going through your body that feels like your whole back is lighting up, is this now moment. And that is the truth. It's like, well, and people go, holy crap, how do you know I'm experiencing that? Because I can see it and feel it if I choose to. And that's psychokinesis. That is an example of unification. It just gets more exciting by the second, just us just hanging out.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't follow that. That was just brilliant. That was fascinating. You just had me completely enthralled there. By the way, the person I have remembered is a guy called Robert Bruce.
Okay.
Just if you're wondering, I met him in Melbourne. Where are you from in Australia?
Sydney, New South Wales.
Oh, Sydney. Yeah, we went up to Sydney.
Melbourne. It's always the commonality is, oh, I'm sorry, you're from Melbourne. Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, as they said when I was out there, they said, yeah, sort of Sydney's a bluesy blonde and Melbourne is a sedate brunette. And that's probably how I felt it was. You know, I really, it was quite an interesting dynamic there. But anyway, well, thank you. I mean, we're almost out of time now, and it's been, as it was last time, an extraordinary exchange of ideas and a generation of egregore. I'm going to be pointing out to various people to check this out when it goes live. I particularly want my Greek friends to watch this. Because I'm sure they will find it fascinating. There's half a dozen other people who within my group go towards the esoteric, and they will find it absolutely intriguing. I'm absolutely sure. So Sam, thank you very much. That was really quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. Thank you.
We've just got started, my friend. It's time.
We have. I think we have.
Tune it up. It's,
absolutely.
It's like very much in line. And the funny thing is, the way that I transcribe books, the book that I was talking to you about that I want to start with your information, if you allow me to, I'm going to correlate that. That'll probably take me a day or two. So maybe a day, because I just sit there and Latsu just pours it out. And it happens I've written or witnessed transcribing 300-page book inside of 2 or 3 hours.
Wow.
So
wish I could do that.
Well, it's I'm not wasting any time when you have this incredible information that you have basically accumulated over your lifetime that is 1000% in line with all the esoteric alchemical processes that I've been teaching people for decades. That's we wonderful. Need to bring it out. With of course your permission. I would like
absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm going to have to shoot because my wife will be knocking on the door any second.
Well, let me close this out, and I'm going to end the recording, then have a 2-second conversation before you shut the door. Okay. This has been fantastic. Thank you, Tony. I can't wait to do this again. I'm your humble servant in seafood, Taoist Master San Qing, and we'll see you in the next one.